Welcome to A Slice of SEL, a podcast for educators about social emotional learning.
All right, guys, welcome to A Slice of SEL, episode 4. This is a podcast from the St. Croix River Education District, and we are doing a slow drip of information about social emotional learning with our member districts. Rai, could you tell us where this podcast is available?
Yes, we are available on all of your favorite podcast apps and including YouTube. So if you're listening to audio, we'll be describing what we're showing to our YouTube audience by sharing our screen.
We are the SEL services team at the St. Croix River Ed District. I'm Courtney.
I'm Rai.
And I'm Nick. And this week we are finishing a two-part episode essentially about what SEL is. So last week, if you didn't listen to episode 3, why don't you pause and do that first? We talked about the why of SEL. We talked about the research of why it's important and effective that we do these practices. And what it does for our students, for parents and communities, and for ourselves. This week, we're going to focus on the how, so the practices. We're going to give a broad overview of every practice and procedure and everything under that SEL umbrella. But before we do that, we're going to talk about our favorite segment, what's filling our buckets.
So what is filling our buckets today, you guys? I know for me, I'm just happy to be back at work. I was sick for a couple of days, so just seeing your faces and being with people is filling my bucket for sure. What about you, Rai?
Well, remember last couple episodes when we were talking about that Minnesota second summer, was how that was filling my bucket. 2 weeks ago it was 80 degrees, and like 2 days ago, we've accumulated close to 8 inches of snow. So I am just really grateful for the Minnesota surprises that she likes to throw at us. Also, I did hear that it's supposed to be like 60 degrees next week. So as a true Midwesterner, what's filling my bucket is the weather.
I was in a classroom yesterday and a teacher was playing Christmas music, and from our conversation, I really don't think that had anything to do with the weather. I think that's just she's one of those like early Christmas folks. But the snow falling beautifully today really does make that you could almost justify, listening to the Christmas music in October.
For sure.
What's filling my bucket is I finally started watching The Golden Girls, which I've been just hearing was amazing for the longest time. And I finally started watching it. I got through the first 2 seasons over MEA break. And Betty White's character, Rose, I really relate to the most at this point. And she's from like St. Olaf, Minnesota, small town, a little naive, and she reminds me so much and likes to tell stories, and she reminds me a lot of my mom. Every time she busts out a story about small town Minnesota, it just reminds me of my mom. And every time she talks about a really long story and the other characters like roll their eyes a little bit, I'm reminded of how long-winded I can be.
Who doesn't love Betty
White? I just adore Betty White. She's the best.
For sure. National treasure.
National treasure for sure. So we're going to shift and talk about our main topic, and this could be a long episode. Who knows? Again, last week we talked about the why of SEL, and just to recap a couple highlights, teacher well-being and retention is something we started with because it's something that really matters. And like, it's kind of like a chicken and an egg deal, which came first. It doesn't really matter. Like if our teachers are doing well, our students are going to do well. And these practices that we're going to talk about today are meant to help our teachers take care of themselves and also set up their classrooms and their schools where students are going to be in a good place and able to focus on learning. And there's just that synergistic, like, if our students are doing well and they have the SEL skills to take care of themselves, put themselves in a good headspace, they can focus on the learning. They're more engaged. Teachers really want to help students learn. That's kind of the whole reason we're all in education, and it all just works better as a cycle if we have SEL as part of the equation. So that's just a little bit about the why. And kind of part of the why is just what are these skills the kids are learning. So please listen to last week's episode for a more in-depth recap, but there are 5 standards areas of SEL. And we talked last week about there are Minnesota SEL standards and benchmarks for each grade level, and they're in 5 areas. It's self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. So those are the 5 standards areas. And we're actually one of 18 states that at this point have adopted SEL standards. We did it in 2018. I don't know that we were quite on the bleeding edge, but we are part of the first 18 as far as states go, which is cool. So it's all about building those skills in ourselves and our students. And we're going to talk today about how we do that. And the resource we're going to be looking at today that grounds that conversation is the Universal SEL Toolkit on our cross-district website. And I am going to pull that up. So if you are an audio only listener, maybe skip like the next 90 seconds or so if you want to. We're just going to talk about how we get to the Universal SEL Toolkit. So I'm typing in tinyurl.com/SEL site. So that takes me to the homepage of the SEL website. And I'm going to scroll down to the section that says, how do people learn these SEL skills? And what's on the homepage of our website is a short brochure-ish kind of short explanation of 6 categories. And I like to call them like 6 buckets. There's these 6 buckets that we can put these practices and organize them into. I'm just going to cover all 6 briefly, and then we're going to dive into each one. So SEL instruction. Teachers are actually teaching the why, how, and when of different SEL skills. So there's direct or explicit teaching that occurs around these SEL skills, SEL instruction. There's supportive classroom and school climates. So everything that's happening outside of that direct SEL instruction, everything we're doing to clearly communicate the rules and expectations so students can actually understand them and know kind of what the bar is for behavior in our school, building relationships with kids, waving at kids, the pacing of our instruction, using choices in our instruction, all this kind of ether that's just all around us all the time whenever we're in a school building is part of SEL. Supportive discipline. So when our students make mistakes, helping them learn from those mistakes is like the quickest elevator speech of that. And we'll go into more detail later. A continuum of integrated supports. So if you're familiar with RTI, response to intervention, multi-tiered systems of support, depending on what jargon you're familiar with, this idea that we have a strong core for all of our kids. But if some of our kids aren't making expected progress with only that core, we have extra or supplemental supports that we can target on those students. That's part of SEL. Educator SEL, we spent the first 2 episodes of the podcast talking about taking care of ourselves through teamwork and having supportive teams. So there's a lot more to it, but Educator SEL, we're learning those skills ourselves. And then stakeholder partnerships. So this isn't entirely centered on the educators teaching the students and what's happening in the school building at all times. SEL extends out to the homes and the communities. So family and community voices need to be part of the conversation about what we're teaching our kids, how we're teaching it, so they can be part of building those skills in the homes and in the communities. So that's kind of a brief look at, again, kind of the brochure of these 6 buckets of practices. And we're going to dive in now and talk a little bit more in detail about each one. So if I click Learn More, I get taken to the Universal SEL Toolkit. And this is like the one-stop shop of one-stop shops. Everything that we offer as resources to leadership teams in our schools to implement SEL at the school-wide level, all of that is in this web page. So it's a lot. And we're not going to talk about every single resource that's on this page. That would take hours and hours and hours. We're just going to talk about, again, kind of the categories or the buckets of practices. And SEL instruction is our first. So below that, within that large bucket of SEL instruction, we have 2 subcategories or sub-buckets. Explicit SEL instruction. So the way to describe this would be like the standalone SEL lessons. I can walk into a classroom and recognize that the teacher is standing in front of the students talking about how we resolve conflict, or talking about a growth mindset, talking about how to organize tasks and keep track of your to-do list. So you can walk in and recognize like that's the lesson. The entire lesson is about like the learning targets are about those things. So we have curriculums that are research-based that allow us to do that and allow us to target those standards and benchmarks for our students and provide instruction that directly targets those. So that's, explicit SEL instruction. That's what the explicit part means. Like it's clearly evident that that's what we're doing with our instruction there. And when we talk about the playing field for SEL, I think that's a good term. If you think about it from like how SEL relates to academics, if we're talking about math instruction or reading instruction, instruction is our primary playing field. So the teacher and the students in the classroom engaging in that instruction around math to hit those math standards, that's the main playing field. Would you guys say that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but for SEL, there's a bigger playing field, and kind of everything else we're going to talk about is part of that bigger playing field. So besides the direct explicit instruction, we also have integrated instruction. So a student might have 25 minutes of their day devoted to the SEL instruction, say the explicit SEL instruction. They spend the rest of their day in classrooms learning about math, history, science, reading, special subjects. And in all those other subjects, they can continue to learn about SEL skills. And we call this SEL integrated instruction. And to talk brass tacks, what it literally looks like is if I have a lesson plan and learning targets on there for history class, I might have 2 learning targets that are targeted to the core history standards. And then I might have a 3rd learning target that's about the SEL standards. And if my lesson is focusing on a historical figure, when we have a reflection activity to help with that SEL standard, we could talk about like, what do you think greater self-awareness would have done for this historical figure in this situation? So you can bring it in naturally where it doesn't take away from the academic instruction, the content, but it's just clearly identifying it so we can be more intentional about what we're doing. Because SEL is it's everywhere. It's human behavior. So it's connected to what we're talking about in every other subject area. Like I just brought up, like historical figures were humans too. They used their SEL skills well, or with some room for improvement, depending on the historical figure you're talking about. So, and in English class as well, when you're talking about like literature, and you can bring in emotional vocabulary words and say like, what feeling words did these people, what do you think they were feeling in these situations? So there's tons of different ways that you can integrate SEL instruction meaningfully so that it supports academic instruction.
Yeah, I think it also helps generalize some of those skills. We talk a lot about generalization of skills in SEL, but finding ways to connect what you just said to actual real life situations and scenarios as they're learning through some of that curriculum, just helps develop even some of that rationale for why did this person need to develop greater self-awareness skills, and kind of put it into a bigger context.
Yeah, and I think that the takeaway here is like it's going to happen whether we're planning to do it or not, because the SEL skills are so inherent to just being a human being, either using them well or not using them well, but like the concepts are really ingrained in us. Like it's just conceptualizing human behavior. We're all self-aware. But with SEL standards and benchmarks that are developmentally appropriate, anchoring our curriculum at a district level and our practices, and then intentionally tying it to like the learning targets in the lesson plan. Like where can I intentionally, systematically, consistently tie this in? That's just a better way of doing things where we're more consistent and students get more horizontal alignment between teachers. We're doing a similar experience for every student in this school, regardless of the teacher that they're receiving their instruction from. I feel really fancy for using horizontal alignment. I feel like I used it accurately. I'm trying to pick up, tricks and lingo from my academic colleagues more and more. So the next super bucket of practices we're going to talk about is supportive classroom and school climates. And boy, is this a super bucket of practices. There is a lot, think about that phrase, supportive classroom and school climates. That is a lot. Just the entire school, the hallways, the lunchroom, the classrooms themselves, our classroom management, our engaging instruction, just everything basically that's happening feeds into this idea of having a supportive classroom and a supportive school in its entirety. So there's a lot in here. And that's true for the first subcategory or sub-bucket we're looking at, which is supportive classrooms and relationships. So this is greeting students when they come into the classroom. This is offering choices in your lesson plan so students have more agency. This is the voice tone that you're using when you are presenting your instruction. This is what we talked about previously, I don't know in the podcast yet, Courtney, but how you would kind of target a specific row of seats in your classroom to get to know those students better. So you made sure you got everyone.
I was just thinking about my time in my other district that I worked in and how there was a teacher who she specifically taught this like personal development or personal enrichment class. But then when she switched over to doing more of this intervention stuff, she brought all of that like SEL focused stuff to her other classroom. And it just like the kids responded so well to it. And she was constantly checking in with them, getting their input. And I just think it made a huge difference for those kids who weren't special ed at the time, but it was really helpful.
Yeah, so there's so much to learn here and so much to unpack. And in subsequent episodes, we will certainly dive more into this idea of creating a supportive classroom and supportive relationships with your students, because there's so much nuance and craft to doing that and optimizing it. But that's the first sub bucket of this supportive classroom and school climates super bucket. Shared behavior expectations. So there's different ways this could look. If you look at the graphic here, we're looking at the screen, it's kind of meant to represent like the typical stereotypical PBIS idea of safe, respectful, responsible is a very popular frame, but having 3 to 5 positively stated expectations that are defined in each setting. And essentially what this achieves is like when I was in middle school, I'm just going to bring it back to that. What the central kind of communication around our discipline and our expectations is like, here's the student code of conduct. There's a ton of things in here about what you should and shouldn't do. Memorize it. And if you screw up, it's all on you. Like, I'm giving you this code of conduct. We might talk about it once in the school year for maybe 15 minutes, but it's up to you to memorize it and follow it. And I earned a lot of demerits in middle school because I didn't memorize the student code of conduct. And didn't get reminded of it clearly, which is the more important part. Like it wasn't infused into my day-to-day life. I didn't get those like key reminders right before I might have made a mistake about what the expectations are. So having consistent, clearly communicated expectations that students can actually digest, that become a meaningful part of their day. So like pre-correction for one, like a hugely important thing. So like before we transition in the classroom, maybe before we do independent seat work, we just finished whole group instruction, what you might call lecturing. And now we're going to do independent seat work with a worksheet. And in that transition, I say, when you're working at your desks, remember it's important we're respectful and we keep our voices at a table talk voice and raise our hands if we have a question. So those kind of pre-correction short little prompts that take the expectations into the day-to-day flow of the classroom so that students constantly get this clear communication about what we're expecting. It's not, a silver bullet. It doesn't achieve everything on its own. I don't want you to think that, but it is a big step in setting our students up for success. I probably would have earned fewer demerits if that was the kind of deal that my school had in place. Okay, and our next sub bucket or subcategory, reinforcement of expected behavior. So praise is a big part of this, but it's not all of it. Some schools have a ticket system, for example, where they acknowledge students by giving them a prize ticket that they can turn in. You were respectful and here's why, here's what I saw. You helped your peer with their worksheet when they needed help and I was busy helping another student. You were respectful, awesome. And then we have a ticket. So there could be rewards, incentives as part of it, or there could not. The praise that I just gave in that example is a really key part, and specifically telling students what we saw that we liked. So if I were standing in the back of a classroom with a tablet, just assigning kids points like a video game when I see them do things that are expected that I like, and I never told them about it or told them why, and we just kind of celebrated at the end of the day, like, oh, you earned 500 points. That's a fairly meaningless exercise, and it's definitely not as impactful as if I have that communication with the kid and that praise about what I liked. And then our next subcategory or sub bucket is cultural responsiveness. So making sure that the curriculum that we're using, the dialogues we're having in the classroom are inclusive and make it a welcoming place for people with all kinds of backgrounds and lived experiences. Next is school climate and discipline data. So there's a lot here. Again, we're just giving kind of a superficial level review of everything that's part of SEL, but school climate, you might do a student survey that talks about relationships, say, like how good are your relationships with adults in the building? How good are your relationships with peers? Just like a couple example things that could ask about. So that's like school climate. And discipline data, it's really important that we routinely, and by routinely, I mean like at least monthly, some people in the building are looking at our discipline trends and say, like, are we having a trend of a lot of out of classroom referrals second hour from a particular area of the school maybe, but trying to look at those trends and then organize responses to it. So if we have a lot of referrals from the lunch hour, second lunch period, how we might respond to that would be reviewing our behavior expectations for lunch on Wednesday, the 25th before lunch. So all of our kids get a refresh and a pre-teach on those behavior expectations for lunch and why, because we spotted that trend and we're responding to it. And then mental health support. So we could have campaigns around reducing mental health stigma. For example, if you have a student leadership organization, they could be part of that. Connecting students proactively with mental health resources in the community, third-party mental health providers, therapists in the community, and then proactively teaching our staff about warning signs for mental health issues, for warning signs of depression, of self-harm, of suicidal ideation, so that they can do that warm handoff to the team in the building that is going to intervene with that student and connect them with the support they need. So mental health support is a huge part of having a supportive school climate. And that is that massive bucket we just tied up there of a supportive classroom and school climates. And we're going to move on to supportive discipline. So this is our third super bucket of practices that we're talking about with what's under the SEL umbrella, all just buckets and umbrellas. The first part of supportive discipline is consistent and equitable discipline responses. So the graphic here is kind of trying to illustrate a familiar concept to some, majors and minors. So we essentially look at violations of the student code of conduct. So being disruptive in class, physical aggression, like chewing gum, all these different things, talking to a peer during class when we're supposed to be listening. We look at those and define the intensity of them. So is that a major behavior where we would quickly proceed to an out of classroom referral, or is it a minor behavior where it would be called maybe teacher managed? You know, we're going to take some steps to try and intervene and keep the student in class. Whatever that looks like specifically in the building is going to vary, but the idea and the phrase consistent and equitable is that we have those conversations and work on that as a whole building, so that, again, that kind of horizontal alignment deal, whatever teacher a student is getting their instruction from in whatever classroom they're in, there are consistent thresholds for behavior and consistent ways that we're responding, so that the experience that a student has is going to be similar.
As a teacher, when I was in the classroom, that would probably be the biggest concern I ever heard from my students, especially the ones who struggled, was well, I do this in this room and nothing happens, and I do this in the other classroom and I get sent out every time. And they're just making sure that those things were very clearly laid out, not only for staff members so they understood, but for the students as well. I think once we finally got a more clear practice in place, it helped relieve a lot of teacher anxiety and student anxiety.
Yeah, and I can talk for the last 3 years as a working in a setting for behavior program where that was a huge part of what we did every week. We would have meetings where we talked about our thresholds and how we were responding and practiced responding similarly. It helped me so much. I never felt more comfortable knowing what I was supposed to do and knowing that my colleagues were going to respond in a similar way and that we were on the same page. A lot of our stress, I think, in those situations comes from, if I'm a teacher and maybe I'm talking to a student in the hallway having a conversation and the principal walks by, I want to make sure that, and I'll feel more comfortable if I know, like, this is a typical practice in our building and this is what we're supposed to be doing. And this is how any other teacher would respond in this situation. Just being on the same page as an adult with the other adults in the building about what we do lends kind of, Courtney, to what you're saying about that comfort. Effective and restorative discipline responses is the next part of this we're going to talk about. And the idea here is, I'm going to use the word exclusionary, and I'm going to define what that means. But what we've learned at a national level from a lot of decades of research into this is that if we primarily rest on a discipline system that is removing a student from the classroom or removing a student from the school building, and then having maybe a contrived consequence. So that removal itself might be the consequence. And when I say contrived, I'm talking about the opposite of a logical consequence. That phrase logical consequence gets thrown around a lot in schools. We're going to talk about what that actually means. Contrived versus logical. So if I make a mess in the lunchroom and cause a disruption, and the consequence for me is exclusion, and that's it. Like, I get suspended for a day. So, and that's exclusion and it's contrived. It's not linked to what the impact of my behavior was. Instead, having a logical consequence and then unpacking the impact. So learning how this affected the school community and the adults, having those conversations, learning what I should have done instead. So there is some like SEL instruction responsively. We might talk about what skills should we have used in that situation and practice those. And then my logical consequence. So I might clean up the lunchroom or help the lunch staff for a day or two. And this is there's logistics here. It's a tricky thing to implement and define and get as close to that logical consequence as possible. But I'm just laying out, like, that's kind of like the spectrum, and it's our goal to get as close to these logical, meaningful consequences and building those skills that we're missing that we should have used, because our goal is long-term success. And coming back to that research lens, what we've just learned is we don't want to re-experience the same problem over and over again. And if we do primarily just exclusionary discipline with contrived consequences, we're more likely to experience that problem over and over. And it might take a little bit more work, and it's just an adjustment of mindset to have this like restorative, how do we restore what happened through a logical consequence and through learning. There's more to that. It's a little bit more sophisticated, but the goal is to not experience that problem over and over again. And if we do that well, we're less likely to experience that problem over and over again. And that's really what it's all about. I mean, the primary goal of a discipline system is that reducing the likelihood that we're going to experience that violation of the code of conduct again. So having an effective discipline system that achieves that for us is really what it's all about. To that end, threat assessment. So if there are student threats of violence in the school building, having an effective practical response to that versus maybe primarily an exclusionary one. So if a student makes a threat of violence, investigating that. And we picked a magnifying glass for our icon here, because that's really what this is all about. Investigating the context of that statement and making sure that our response is appropriate so we can keep that student safe and all the other students and staff in the building safe. So threat assessment is a set of practices that allow us to investigate those statements, those threats of violence, and respond in a way that's going to keep everyone in the building safe. And that's the supportive discipline super bucket. Now we get to a continuum of integrated supports. So our icon here is 3 circles, one with a ton of students in it, one with a few, and one with 1 student. And if you're familiar with the RTI triangle, response to intervention, or its evolution, a multi-tiered system of support, that's kind of the idea here. And we talk about how SEL is behavior MTSS. So if you're familiar with the RTI triangle, going back to the 90s, like the left side of academic RTI, right side behavior RTI, we're evolving. Our understanding of this is changing, but there is, I just wanted to link to that common understanding. Essentially, the idea here again is we have a strong core of instruction and practices for all of our students. And that's most of what we're talking about in this podcast episode today, is that core. It's stuff we offer to all the kids in the building. But if our students aren't making progress only with that core level of support, only with that core level of SEL instruction and all the other things we're talking about, we have to provide additional supplemental support. And that's what this continuum idea is about. So screening is part of that. So through a self-report survey or a staff report, some method of screening all of our students for their SEL competence and their risk factors, and some methods of this focus more on strengths, some focus more on risk, but we're screening all of our students like we do for academics and identifying the at-risk students who need this extra level of support. We would offer those students different terminology here. Tier 2 is one terminology, targeted. The idea is we're focusing on a select group and we're offering them kind of a standard methodology. Standard treatment protocol is one word for it. Plug and play intervention is my personal favorite. It's rapidly accessible. It's going to be there. It's a program that works the same way for all the students that we plug into it. And we match a student well with the kind of programming they need. So, they've still got their core support, and then we offer them this extra scoop, this supplement, and it works the same way for them as it does for maybe 20 other students in the building who all have a similar kind of need, and we plug them in. We track their progress with that, and that's through something called progress monitoring. So we just pick, like we would with reading fluency. If we give extra instruction in reading fluency, we practice that more with the student. We're going to do something with the student. We want to know if it's working or not. So we define some way of, we're going to work on their organizational skills. So every week or so, maybe we measure their organizational skills and we keep track of that. If we're not making enough progress, we can adjust what we're doing, but we also might need to move to what we call like an individualized intervention. So this doesn't mean that the student is going to get support only one-on-one. That's kind of a common misconception. We talk about this. It's also called Tier 3, individualized intensive. The idea is that when we're planning what the school day looks like for this kid and the supports and the instruction they're going to get, we're naming that specific student. It's no longer kind of a plug and play deal. At this point, we're naming that particular student and designing individual tweaks just for them. And we are going to intensify as well. So it's not just changing for the sake of change, it's also upping our efforts. So if we were meeting with them once a week to work on their organizational skills, as an example, we are going to intensify. So we might meet for longer, or we might meet more often, or both. And part of what facilitates all of this is teams. So we have teams that review our screening data to make sure that students are matched, identified as at risk and matched with those interventions. And we have teams that review the progress monitoring data and adjust our interventions, and if necessary, refer students for those individualized intensive interventions. So teams of adults have to be working in the building to make all that happen. So SEL is definitely behavior MTSS. Educator SEL, our next super bucket. So as I mentioned, we talked in our first 2 episodes about teamwork, and that's part of this, but self-care and wellness are as well. And our first subcategory here is educators SEL competence and self-care. So are we having trainings and professional learning sessions on our well-being, how to take care of ourselves? on wellness. So like the wellness wheel, for example, in a PLC meeting I was in last year, we took the wellness wheel, which I won't explain it in depth here, but it's kind of looking at the areas of wellness: physical, intellectual, emotional, social, financial. Those are the ones I can think of off the top of my head. And reflecting personally on how we're doing in all of those areas and setting personal goals for that. So there's tons we could talk about with self-care, and we're going to focus in the podcast, I think, next on some areas of self-care from here on out. But self-care is absolutely part of Educator SEL and building our own competence. And then besides self-care, so our modeling and our collaboration. So modeling the SEL skills that we're learning for ourselves and collaborating effectively with each other. And that's where that teamwork piece comes into play. If I were giving an elevator speech on this, teamwork is one thing I would focus on. So when we're working together in grade level teams or PLCs with our colleagues, setting it up so that we have supportive meetings and get along with each other well and can collaborate effectively. It's a big part of SEL for our students, but also for ourselves. And then our last super bucket, stakeholder partnerships. So we mentioned this isn't just a school deal. These students are living in their homes and in the communities, and their SEL skills are going to be used there and practiced there. So we need to get families and communities involved. Student voice is a big part of it too. So student leadership and input, if they're in the elementary grades, maybe you might not call it leadership, but input into what we're doing. So student surveys or focus groups, or just getting input from the students about how we're doing SEL in the school and what we're doing. And then as they get older, actual leadership, like student leadership groups are key. So finding opportunities and creating opportunities for student voice to be heard. I think I highlighted in another episode, there's a high school that has a great peer leadership team for their PBIS, and that's awesome. Just a great example of this. Family partnerships. So involving families at a leadership level, if we have a SEL leadership team in the school or in the district, having opportunities for families to be directly involved in that way, but also just two-way communication with our families. So social media updates about what the school is doing with SEL, flyers and handouts that go home about what SEL instruction we're doing, with some tips about how families can support those at home. There's so many examples of what this can look like, but intentionally creating opportunities for families to be involved and be partners with the school. This is so important. And then community partnerships. So there are community leaders and Boys and Girls Club, for example, third-party mental health providers, lots of examples of organizations that the school should be partnering with and informing them of what we're doing at the school level to support SEL. I know I've been personally in some meetings with hospital staff where the school stakeholders sat down in a conference room with hospital staff who work with mental health and just talked about what we do to support SEL and mental health at school, and shared information. So those kind of community partnerships are key.
I also know that there's a few communities in the area, and I obviously don't travel too much out of the area, but where those 3 to 5 community things that the school has posted, some businesses will have those little posters too in their place of business, like restaurants or in the shop window. So if it's responsible, respectful, whatever, they will have those and echo what the school is enforcing, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, and you've told me about that, and I know of a couple, I believe Bram School District, if I recall correctly, I may be off with that, has done that within the community. Yep. And I think it's extremely, extremely cool. I know
too, actually.
Rush City, yeah.
I think they do.
They're doing an amazing job with their PBIS in Rush City. And that brings me back to family partnerships. One thing that we did at my last school for our 3 to 5 expectations, safe, respectful, responsible, we had a sheet that went home and parents could define what those look like at home and frame kind of their home expectations around those, so that there's a lot of continuity between school and home. All right, so that took a while, but we thought it would. That's the how of SEL. This is, all the practices that fall under that massive umbrella. We talked about the whole umbrella and then the 6 buckets beneath it. And just to recap, the 6 buckets we talked about were SEL Instruction, supportive classroom and school climates, number 2, supportive discipline, a continuum of integrated supports, Educator SEL, the 5th one, and then stakeholder partnerships. Those are the 6 super buckets that we talked about of practices in our podcast episode today. And we talked about the playing field. I'm going to come back to that as we talk about takeaways. And for academics, we've got our academic standards. For 4th graders, we know what math standards we need to hit. And our instruction is our primary playing field for getting there. So the teacher teaching and learning in the classroom, directly teaching those math skills. For SEL, we have that as well. And we have SEL standards and benchmarks in Minnesota. We're one of 18 states that do currently. And we have evidence-based curriculums that, just like evidence-based math curriculums, target those standards and benchmarks. What's a little bit different is that our playing field is just a lot bigger than that. We have the direct instruction in the classroom, but we also have the other 5 buckets that we talked about: the supportive classroom and school climates, the discipline, the Educator SEL. There's all this extra stuff that we're doing that permeates the whole school day and the home and the community to teach those SEL skills. So our playing field is massive.
So thanks for spending time with us today. Make sure to subscribe if you're on YouTube. Click the bell so that you're notified when new episodes are released each week. We'll see you next time when you come back for another slice of SEL.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Bye.